In the spring of 1854, the entire Caldwell family of Fayette County, Kentucky, 7 members across 3 generations died within a single month, each succumbing to a bizarre illness that left physicians from Louisville to Cincinnati utterly baffled. The symptoms were identical: intense skin irritation that turned into open sores, followed by high fever delirium, and ultimately death. What made this tragedy more chilling was that every victim had recently donned custom-tailored garments made by the same hands. The authorities quickly buried the case along with the bodies, but long-hidden letters from the era have unearthed a truth so sinister it was deliberately erased from history. The garments were sewn by a house slave named Dinah, and her quiet act of revenge was as brilliant as it was lethal. Before we dive deeper into the harrowing tale of Dinah and the Caldwell plantation, if you're captivated by the darker corners of American history that were buried and forgotten, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from fellow seekers of hidden truths. What happened on that Kentucky plantation would forever alter the way we understand resistance within the antebellum South, where desperation and intelligence combined to create some of the most haunting forms of justice. The Caldwell estate spanned 300 acres of lush bluegrass, just 17 miles southeast of Lexington, and stood as one of Fayette County's most prosperous plantations. Its tobacco fields were legendary, yielding crops that brought top dollar in Louisville, while its Georgian colonial mansion, framed by 6 towering white columns and wraparound verandas, looked out like a fortress over an empire. Samuel Caldwell inherited the estate in 1839, and over the next 15 years expanded it into a diversified powerhouse: tobacco, hemp, lumber, and even a bourbon distillery that shipped as far as Chicago and New Orleans. By 1854, Samuel owned 57 enslaved people and was known for managing his holdings with ruthless efficiency. His wife, Margaret Henley Caldwell, came from Old Virginia tobacco wealth and ruled the domestic sphere with equal precision, bringing 12 of her family's enslaved people into the marriage. Also living in the house was Samuel's mother, Constance, a sharp-minded 74-year-old matriarch who believed deeply in traditional Southern hierarchies and took personal charge of disciplining the household slaves. Their 3 children represented the next generation of Kentucky's slaveholding elite. Thomas, 22, was a recent graduate of Transylvania University with political ambitions and a violent streak. Mary Elizabeth, 20, was engaged to the heir of a neighboring estate in what was to be the social event of the season. And 17-year-old Samuel Jr. was already absorbing every detail of plantation management, from soil chemistry to psychological control tactics. Completing the household was Margaret's unmarried sister, Catherine Henley, who had moved in after their father's death. Beneath the polished surface of this empire, however, something far darker was taking shape, an unseen hand quietly setting in motion a reckoning born of both intellect and vengeance. At 28, Catherine Caldwell had turned down multiple suitors to preserve her independence. Yet life within her brother's estate gave her unchecked authority over enslaved people without the burden of managing land. Her cruelty was infamous even among Kentucky's harsh plantation elite. The wealth and social standing of the Caldwell family depended entirely on the labor of 57 enslaved individuals who worked endlessly to sustain their empire. Among them, none held more value than a 29-year-old house slave named Dinah. Her unmatched skill as a seamstress made her indispensable. She could replicate high fashion from Paris and New York with perfect precision, crafting intricate embroidery and tailoring garments that rivaled anything seen in Charleston or Richmond. Trained by her mother, Ruth, the previous head seamstress Dinah had secretly learned to read and write illegal skills that elevated her worth and gave her a dangerous edge. She studied not just fashion magazines, but the books in the Caldwell Library, absorbing knowledge in chemistry, botany, and medicine, returning each volume to its place without raising suspicion. Her brilliance remained hidden behind a carefully maintained mask, capable, but never bold-educated, but never outspoken, loyal, but not defiant. Yet under that surface simmered a growing rage. The winter of 1853 into 1854 had been brutal. Failed tobacco harvests pushed Samuel Caldwell to tighten his grip. Longer hours, smaller rations, harsher punishments. House slaves like Dinah bore the brunt of these frustrations, and her days stretched to 18-hour marathons of needlework, repairing linens, and creating elaborate outfits for the family's endless social obligations. The final blow came when Samuel decided to sell Dinah's 14-year-old daughter Sarah to pay off a gambling debt Thomas had accrued during college. Of 5 children, only 3 of Dinah's had survived, and the threat of losing Sarah shattered any hope she had left. In the sleepless, grief-stricken nights that followed, Dinah began crafting her revenge, using the very talents that made her valuable. Her weapon would be her needle, her battlefield, the wardrobes of her oppressors. Posing as the ever-dutiful seamstress, she accepted Margaret's commission to produce an extravagant spring wardrobe meant to dazzle society. She selected the finest imported fabrics, taffeta, cotton, lawn, and lace, tailoring each piece with exquisite care. But behind every stitch lay a hidden purpose. Months of study had taught Dinah how to harness plant-based toxins and apply them in a way that would cause lingering fatal harm. Her creations would become silent instruments of justice, beautifully lethal and impossible to trace. The key to Dinah's vengeance lay not in the garments themselves, but in the thread. Working silently before dawn in the solitude of the sewing room, she soaked select strands in deadly solutions crafted from the plantation's own fields. Pokeweed root dried and concentrated from last autumn, poison sumac oil, jimson weed seed extract, and toxins from mushrooms that thrived in the damp shadows of the tobacco barns. Her method was precise, scientific. She tested each preparation on fabric swatches, tracking potency over time, experimenting with how best to bind the toxins to textiles so they would remain invisible yet lethal. She used the poison thread only in areas guaranteed to touch skin collars, cuffs, waistbands, seams, calculating just enough to cause a slow, relentless decline without triggering immediate suspicion. The first test came with Margaret's new emerald silk dress, a showpiece commissioned for the spring social season. Dinah had poured hours into its design-fitted bodice, elaborate pleating bishop sleeves, each detail flawlessly executed with tainted thread worked into the neckline, cuffs, and waist. On March 12th, Margaret wore it proudly to a luncheon at Judge Harrison Beaumont's home, mingling among Fayette County's elite and basking in compliments that only elevated Dinah's reputation. But as Margaret prepared for bed that night, she began scratching at her neck and wrists. By morning, her skin was inflamed and raw. She assumed it was the starch or new fabric and called in Dr. Harrison Beaumont, a respected Lexington physician, who saw nothing alarming and prescribed a simple salve. He had no idea he was witnessing the effects of a carefully orchestrated poisoning devised by someone with a deep understanding of how toxins travel through skin into the bloodstream. As the days passed, Margaret's blisters worsened, weeping and spreading beyond the original contact points. Fever followed, then lesions in places the dress had never touched. Clear signs of systemic poisoning. Throughout her decline, Dinah moved with calm efficiency, showing concern, offering to make soft cotton clothing to soothe Margaret's skin, never once drawing suspicion. Even as Margaret suffered, the rest of the family continued ordering new garments, giving Dinah fresh opportunities. Samuel Jr. requested riding clothes for a hunting trip, which she tailored with even more potent threads. Thomas, eager to impress at a pro-slavery political rally in Frankfurt, commissioned formal wear coat vest trousers, each stitched with threads soaked in toxins that would create agony beneath the dignified surface. Mary Elizabeth, still consumed with wedding plans, requested a full bridal trousseau, unaware that the hands preparing her gown were also crafting her undoing. Dinah had transformed her needle into a scalpel of retribution, each stitch a silent act of justice. The wedding gown became Dinah's most ambitious and lethal creation, requiring hundreds of yards of thread treated with deadly precision to ensure an immediate and devastating effect. By early April, 3 members of the Caldwell family were suffering from the same symptoms that had first struck Margaret: intense dermatitis, followed by systemic poisoning. Dr. Beaumont, now facing a baffling medical crisis, struggled to reconcile the consistent symptoms with the complete absence of contagion. Only members of the Caldwell family were afflicted, while house slaves who cared for them laundered their garments and maintained the estate remained completely unaffected. The selective nature of the illness defied all known theories of disease transmission, and the pattern became impossible to ignore when Dr. Beaumont realized that each case had followed the use of newly made clothing. But despite the consistency, the garments revealed no visible abnormalities, just expertly tailored fashion crafted from the finest fabrics. What Beaumont couldn't detect was the innovation behind Dinah's poison delivery system. Organic compounds meticulously bound to thread and fabric, invisible to 1854 science and undetectable without chemical analysis that wouldn't exist for decades. As April wore on, the suffering deepened. Margaret's wound stabilized, but left her permanently disfigured. Samuel Jr. was left bedridden, his skin a raw map of agony from his riding gear. Thomas, who had worn his formal suit through an entire day of political appearances, collapsed mid-speech in Frankfurt and was rushed to the capital's hospital, where his symptoms were so dramatic, witnesses believed he had been the victim of an acid attack. A messenger arrived at the Caldwell plantation on April 15th, bearing grim news Thomas was not expected to survive. Samuel Caldwell erupted, convinced that his family was under attack by abolitionist enemies targeting Kentucky's political elite. He hired private investigators from Louisville who interrogated neighbors, business partners, and political allies, searching for motives, vendettas, any trace of conspiracy. They tested food, water, household items, but found nothing. Their obsession with external threats gave Dinah the freedom to expand her campaign. Calmly, she continued her duties, her loyalty so deeply ingrained in the Caldwell worldview that suspicion never touched her. But even as the investigators combed through the family's affairs, she was already preparing her next victims: elderly. Constance, the cruel and bitter Catherine, and Samuel Caldwell himself. These final garments would reflect the culmination of her experiments, combining her knowledge of toxin absorption dosage and delayed onset with chilling mastery. Yet the psychological strain of maintaining her obedient facade, while systematically poisoning those who had controlled her life, began to show. Small signs, slips in posture, moments of vacant stillness emerged. But they went unnoticed by a family consumed by fear and suspicion. As May approached and outside theories crumbled, the investigators began turning their attention inward. Dr. Beaumont, desperate for answers, began corresponding with medical colleagues nationwide. His letters, later preserved by the American Medical Association, reveal a man teetering at the edge of his understanding, describing symptoms with no basis in known disease. On April 28th, Dr. Marcus Webb from the University of Louisville arrived at the plantation carrying rudimentary toxicology tools and a more rigorous scientific approach. His examinations of tissue samples and garment fragments marked the first attempt to trace the poison to its source. A discovery that would either vindicate or doom the woman whose genius had rewritten the rules of quiet resistance and turned a needle into a weapon of war. Despite the limitations of 1854, Analytical science Dr. Webb's preliminary findings confirmed Dr. Beaumont's growing suspicions the Caldwell family was being systematically poisoned with plant-based toxins delivered through their clothing. He detected toxic organic compounds embedded in fabric samples, though the exact sources and preparation methods so carefully engineered by Dinah remained beyond the reach of contemporary science. As federal marshals and the county sheriff arrived on May 1st, the atmosphere on the Caldwell plantation shifted from anxious confusion to high-stakes investigation. Every enslaved person understood the danger if even one of them was implicated. It could lead to collective punishment, public executions, or mass sale into the brutal Deep South. Samuel Caldwell, increasingly unhinged, had shifted from blaming abolitionists and political enemies to suspecting a traitor within his own walls. The poisonings were too precise, too intimate, too selective to be random. Whoever was behind them had detailed knowledge of the family's routines and unimpeded access to their garments. While Sheriff Benjamin Hargrove initially focused on external threats, his deputy James Fletcher noted details that pointed inward. The illnesses affected only the white family, never their black servants. The poisons were administered through tailored clothing, and the method required advanced understanding of local flora. As investigators closed in, Dinah maintained her facade with practiced calm, carrying out her tasks, expressing concern, even assisting with care for the very people she was slowly killing. But the toll was visible to those who knew how to look. Solomon Wright, a 73-year-old enslaved man who had worked the plantation's medicinal herb garden for decades, began to connect the dots. Respected and permitted unusual freedom for his age and knowledge, Solomon had observed Dinah collecting specific plants under the guise of dye work or medicinal remedies. His familiarity with toxic herbs told him that her patterns were not coincidental. And yet he faced a crushing moral dilemma: say nothing and risk complicity in further deaths, or speak out and condemn the entire enslaved population to potential slaughter. He knew that white authorities wouldn't hesitate to enact collective punishment or frame Dinah's work as a slave uprising. His knowledge had become a psychological noose, tightening with each passing day. Meanwhile, Dinah methodically executed the final phase of her plan. For elderly Constance, she prepared a new mourning gown with a slow-acting but highly potent combination of poisons designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of age and produce long, drawn-out suffering. For Samuel Caldwell, the heart of the system that had dehumanized generations, she created a vest lined with the most lethal toxin cocktail she had ever devised. Thread-soaked multiple times for maximum potency, targeting skin-to-fabric contact points with surgical precision. But her most personal revenge was saved for Catherine, whose cruelty toward the house slaves had left scars deeper than the flesh. Catherine's new corset, crafted with deliberate malice, was engineered to cause grotesque and visible damage so that her agony would be on display for all to witness. These final preparations forced Dinah into increasingly risky movements, navigating the family's private spaces, slipping garments into closets and trunks, always under the guise of authorized duty. Her role as head seamstress gave her access and authority. But each moment she spent near the poisoned garments raised the stakes, testing her composure and endangering everything and everyone she had ever known. As the pressure mounted and investigators closed in, Dinah's psychological transformation became unmistakable to those who truly knew her. Her fellow enslaved people sensed a haunting stillness in her, an eerie calm beyond fear, as if she had detached from the consequences of life or death. Ruth, her mother, and the former head seamstress recognized the signs instantly. She had seen this before in others who had reached the breaking point under slavery's weight and chosen resistance at any cost. Ruth understood that her daughter had accepted her fate and that the mission would be completed even if it ended in her death. The tension exploded on May 8th when Mary Elizabeth, thought to be recovering, suffered a severe relapse after wearing what seemed like an old dress. Dr. Webb quickly confirmed that this garment too had been treated with toxins, proving the poisoner remained active, with continued access to the family's belongings. Sheriff Hargrove ordered an immediate lockdown of the plantation, forbidding anyone from leaving and initiating invasive searches and interrogations of all enslaved individuals. A full examination of the Caldwell mansion revealed a web of poison hidden in plain sight clothing linens and personal items laced with toxic compounds, expertly concealed. Dr. Webb identified at least 7 different poisonous plants used in precise combinations, showing a mastery of synergistic chemistry well beyond what was known at the time. This was no act of desperation. It was a calculated scientific campaign. And yet Dinah had prepared one final blow. On May 9th, as the search expanded, investigators uncovered the true scale of her work. Every garment treated differently with exact measurements of dosage and timing, proving she had been conducting field experiments on the human body under the guise of household service. Hidden beneath the floorboards in her quarters, they found her handwritten notes, pages of chemical formulas, botanical observations, and testing records so advanced they left university-trained scientists in awe. Sheriff Hargrove intensified his interrogation of the enslaved population, hoping to uncover co-conspirators. But most had genuinely known nothing. Dinah had operated alone, balancing perfect secrecy with flawless execution. The only exception was Solomon Wright, the elderly herbalist, whose knowledge of plant medicine had allowed him to piece together what others could not. His confession came with great anguish, born not of betrayal, but necessity. He realized that Dinah would likely be executed regardless, and his silence might doom more lives. Solomon testified that Dinah had begun collecting plants a year prior under the pretense of dye work and healing remedies. She had asked detailed questions about toxins and their effects on skin, though he had assumed her talk of revenge was abstract, not literal. His testimony revealed how deeply she had planned each phase, timing her harvests to the seasons and refining her techniques through relentless experimentation. Dr. Webb's further analysis confirmed that Dinah had developed binding agents that allowed plant-based toxins to fuse with fabric while remaining active for weeks, an innovation decades ahead of its time. Her knowledge of toxin absorption, systemic reactions, and delayed exposure was comparable to trained medical professionals. And when her notes were fully reviewed, they offered more than technical brilliance. They revealed the mind of a woman who had endured unimaginable oppression and channeled her suffering into a mission of terrifying precision. Through chemistry, cunning, and the blade of a needle, Dinah rewrote the language of resistance, not as rebellion in the fields, but as vengeance sewn into silk. Dinah's writings, uncovered alongside her chemical notes, revealed not just a deep personal hatred for the Caldwell family, but a radical political consciousness that stunned the investigators. She understood the symbolic power of terror. Her goal had never been merely personal vengeance. It was to inject fear into the heart of the entire slave-holding class. She believed that the mysterious, inexplicable deaths of prominent plantation owners would spark paranoia across Kentucky and beyond, forcing white society to confront the fragility of its own dominance. For someone officially denied education, her political sophistication was astonishing. She understood that random rebellion achieved little but a slow, systematic poisoning campaign, one that remained unsolved and could be repeated anywhere, could change how the powerful viewed the powerless. Her notes detailed the tragedies that drove her to this point: the forced sale of her younger brother, the threatened sale of her daughter, and a lifetime of bearing witness to calculated cruelty. What emerged from the investigation was the psychological profile of a woman who had transitioned from victim to strategist, from silent laborer to deadly tactician. Her ability to perform servitude while engineering a campaign of murder impressed even seasoned lawmen. When Sheriff Hargrove formally arrested her on May 10th, he did so with a caution that bordered on reverence, aware that this was no ordinary suspect. Dinah's composure during the arrest unnerved every man present. There was no denial, no pleading, only an eerie serenity. During her interrogation, she spoke with unsettling clarity, never confessing, but never disputing the evidence and referencing constitutional protections she technically had no legal right to. What disturbed the officials most was her complete lack of remorse. When told that 3 Caldwells were dead, her only reaction was a quiet satisfaction tinged with concern that her plan might remain unfinished. She had timed everything death staggered for maximum psychological impact, forcing survivors to live in dread. Her poisons had been crafted in stockpiles ready to kill long after her death. This revelation led to a sweeping search of the estate, uncovering more treated garments and materials hidden in Barnes' cabins. Root cellars of proof that her campaign had not only been extensive, but designed to continue even in her absence. Her detailed contingency plans revealed a level of foresight and strategic planning that rivaled military operations. But the most chilling discovery came on May 11th, when investigators found evidence suggesting Dinah was not alone. Hidden letters written in cipher revealed correspondence with literate enslaved people on neighboring plantations. These coded exchanges discussed poison preparation testing and tactics, indicating a possible underground network of enslaved chemists and seamstresses quietly sharing the knowledge of resistance. Among the materials were garments sized for children, indicating Dinah intended her revenge to span generations. As news spread, fear swept through Kentucky's planter class. Federal marshals from Louisville and Frankfort arrived to assess what had escalated into a potential insurrection. The scope widened again when federal investigators linked similar deaths across Kentucky and even into southern Ohio cases, with the same symptoms: unexplained rashes, fever, systemic collapse, always after donning new garments sewn by enslaved women. Dinah's campaign, once believed to be a solitary act of revenge, was now understood as part of a broader invisible war being fought not with guns, but with thread and toxin knowledge and patience, a rebellion hidden in plain sight. Once investigators understood the pattern, it became unmistakable, though it had long gone unnoticed by local authorities who lacked the scope to connect what appeared to be isolated deaths across counties. The revelation that Dinah's methods might have inspired or been shared with other enslaved people sparked widespread panic among Kentucky's planter class. Emergency sessions of the state legislature were convened to address what now appeared to be an organized campaign of domestic sabotage. Marshal William Henderson from Louisville assumed personal control of the widening investigation, arriving with federal agents experienced in conspiracy cases from other slaveholding states. Their methodical approach revealed something far more complex than a rogue act of vengeance, a decentralized intelligence network operating among literate enslaved individuals, quietly exchanging knowledge of plant-based toxins and application techniques. Under increased interrogation, Dinah showed remarkable composure and resolve. She offered no names, no admissions, no denials, only a quiet resistance designed to shield others. Investigators pored over the letters found among her possessions, coded exchanges cloaked in innocent discussions of herbal medicine and fabric dyeing. Upon closer examination, they contained embedded formulas for the very same poisons that had destroyed the Caldwell family. Even seasoned federal agents were stunned by the sophistication of this covert knowledge-sharing system. An underground communication network built by people who, under the law, were not even supposed to be literate. It became clear that the white fantasy of total control over enslaved communities had been a delusion undermined by ingenuity, memory, and the quiet will to resist. Sheriff Hargrove's questioning of enslaved individuals on neighboring plantations revealed Dinah's story had already spread, carried by whispered awe and uneasy fear. Some expressed admiration for her courage and brilliance, while others worried her discovery would unleash collective punishment. And it did. The psychological impact of her campaign radiated far beyond the Caldwell estate. Across central Kentucky, white families began to regard their most trusted house slaves with suspicion. Seamstresses were dismissed, garments were burned, and panic gripped the planter class. Plantation wives refused to wear anything not imported from northern factories. Fear tainted every stitch. The realization that death could be sewn into a hemline, that resistance could take the form of a ribbon or a thread, fractured the fragile illusion of intimacy that had shielded slavery's domestic sphere. Dinah had proven what no rebellion or uprising had managed to demonstrate so intimately, that the very fabric of the slave-holding world could be unraveled from within one stitch at a time. The fragile trust that had once kept the machinery of slavery running smoothly was shattered, replaced by suspicions so deep it choked the daily operations of plantations across Kentucky. Margaret Caldwell, weakened, but driven by a mixture of vengeance and disbelief, insisted on being present at Dinah's interrogation. What followed on May 13th was one of the most searing confrontations of the entire investigation. Margaret's furious questions, how could Dinah betray a family that had provided for her, were met with cold clarity. Dinah corrected her. The Caldwells had not provided. They had possessed. She had merely been allowed to survive. In exchange for labor the family treated no differently than livestock. Her voice was calm, her posture unshaken as she described the traumas that had pushed her beyond the limits of endurance. Siblings sold children, threatened daily humiliation, endured under the guise of domestic civility. Most unnerving was her explanation of how she'd turned the Caldwells' pride into a weapon. She had known they would eagerly wear the exquisite garments she created, never imagining their obsession with appearance would be their downfall. Her transformation from victim to architect of vengeance was so complete that even seasoned investigators were disturbed by her composure. Then on May 14th, news arrived of Thomas Caldwell's death in Frankfort. His prolonged agony, inflicted by the toxins woven into his formal wear, ended just days after collapsing at a pro-slavery political rally, precisely the outcome Dinah had envisioned. In her notes, Thomas had been marked as the central figure in her plan, not just for his cruelty, but for his ambition to extend slavery across the frontier. His public death was her message to the system itself. Dr. Webb's final report revealed just how advanced her methods had been. Her toxin extraction, stabilization, and binding techniques wouldn't be replicated by trained chemists for another 2 decades. But no scientific breakthrough could save her from the law's inevitable judgment. In Kentucky, there was only one sentence for an enslaved person who murdered their master death by hanging, often preceded by torture to force out names of collaborators. Her execution was scheduled for May 20th. Yet even as time ran out, Dinah remained silent, refusing to betray anyone who might have shared her knowledge. Then on May 18th, she made a final request that stunned even the most hardened investigators. She asked to examine the bodies of the deceased Caldwells, claiming there were additional victims whose deaths could only be confirmed by physical inspection. Marshal Henderson suspected a stalling tactic, but Dr. Webb, recognizing the potential value of her insights, urged compliance. What they uncovered as a result of this request would change everything. Just when authorities thought they had reached the end of Dinah's deadly campaign, the most disturbing truth was yet to come. The examination took place in the Caldwell family crypt, a cold stone structure on the edge of the plantation where the bodies of Thomas, Mary Elizabeth, and Samuel Jr. awaited burial. Dinah's demeanor throughout the grim proceedings was eerily clinical. No emotion, no remorse, just the cold precision of a researcher studying the outcomes of her experiment. One by one, she inspected the corpses with the same meticulous focus that had defined every stage of her revenge. What she revealed horrified even the most hardened investigators. Each body bore distinct patterns of tissue damage signatures, she explained of targeted experimentation. Thomas had received the most aggressive blend of toxins designed to induce rapid systemic collapse and death regardless of medical intervention. Mary Elizabeth's body bore internal damage that pointed to poisons chosen to destroy her reproductive system, ensuring the Caldwell bloodline would end with her. Samuel Jr. Jr.'s remains showed signs of prolonged suffering. His poison calibrated not for speed, but for psychological devastation. Yet the most terrifying revelations weren't found in the crypt. They were in the names Dinah gave of those who weren't yet buried. Judge Harrison Beaumont, elder brother to the plantation doctor and the man who had legally sanctioned the separation of enslaved families, had been gifted a new judicial robe by the Caldwells 3 months prior. Dinah had sewn it herself, treating its threads with a slow-acting toxin to mimic natural decline. The judge, already ill, had died 2 days before his symptoms now revealed to be the result of her carefully engineered assault. Mary Elizabeth's fiancé, Jonathan Peaton, heir to a neighboring estate, had received clothing from the Caldwell family during his courtship, garments designed by Dinah to induce sterility and eventual death, severing the alliance between two dynasties. Dr. Webb's tests confirmed the presence of the same plant toxins, albeit in lower, subtler concentrations. But it was her final admission that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Dinah had prepared garments for prominent pro-slavery politicians and businessmen who had visited the plantation under the guise of social calls and political gatherings. Her elevated status as a skilled seamstress, combined with the Caldwell family's social reach, had given her unique access to men who shaped Kentucky's political landscape. Her plan had never been confined to one household. This was a slow-burning insurrection disguised as hospitality. Some toxins had been created to kill, dramatically igniting panic. Others were meant to mimic disease or age, picking off powerful figures without drawing suspicion. According to her notes, Dinah had been preparing for what she called the final phase, a coordinated wave of poisonings aimed at destabilizing the entire slaveholding class. She hadn't just avenged her own suffering, she had weaponized the very fabric of Southern power, one garment at a time. Dinah's final revelation exposed not only the precision of her plan, but the depth of her political intent. Her timeline had been meticulously aligned with the 1854 congressional elections, ensuring that the deaths of pro-slavery politicians would have maximum impact on the national debate over slavery's expansion. This wasn't simply revenge. It was insurgency calculated to destabilize a system that had commodified her body and broken her family. Her awareness of how individual plantations connected to the broader machinery of American power revealed a political intelligence that shattered white assumptions about the intellectual capacity of the enslaved. Sheriff Hargrove's widening investigation confirmed that Dinah's campaign had reached far beyond the Caldwell estate. Sudden illnesses and deaths among elite slaveholding families across central Kentucky, once dismissed as coincidence, now mirrored her exact methods. The realization triggered a statewide panic. Governor Lazarus Powell declared martial law in 5 counties, and federal agents flooded the region. Plantation homes were searched, letters seized, slave quarters interrogated. What they uncovered was terrifying. Dinah's techniques had been shared quietly, deliberately, across a covert network of literate enslaved people. The illusion of control that underpinned the Southern social order collapsed under the weight of this discovery. Even as chaos spread and authorities scrambled to contain the fallout, Dinah faced her impending death with the same composed resolve that had defined every step of her campaign. On the night before her execution, May 19th, she delivered one final statement that would echo across generations. Her voice was calm, but her message carved through the hypocrisy of the society that had condemned her. "You have taught us that human beings can be property," she told the crowd gathered to watch her die. "You have shown us that families can be separated for profit, that children can be sold like livestock, that human suffering is acceptable when it serves white interests. I have simply used your own lessons to teach you what it feels like to be powerless in the face of systematic cruelty." Her execution on May 20th, 1854, was witnessed by over 200 plantation owners, state officials, and onlookers from across Kentucky. Newspapers declared it the end of the most diabolical slave conspiracy in American history. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a terror plantation owners could not unsee. Her final words, recorded by stunned journalists and suppressed by Southern authorities for decades, would one day resurface as one of the clearest, most haunting articulations of resistance ever spoken by an enslaved person. Dinah had used the tools of her oppression, needle thread, silence, and obedience, as instruments of rebellion, sewing not just garments, but fear into the seams of slavery itself. Even in death, Dinah's intelligence and moral clarity shook the ideological foundations of slavery. Her final words, her unwavering calm, and the meticulous nature of her campaign forced white society to confront truths it had long denied. The investigation that followed her execution exposed the full reach of the resistance she had helped ignite. Dr. Webb's analysis confirmed that at least 12 prominent slaveholding families across Kentucky had suffered similar mysterious death cases that matched Dinah's methods with chilling precision. Federal authorities documented over 30 suspicious fatalities among judges, politicians, and wealthy planters, all tied to garments treated with toxic plant compounds. What had once been dismissed as coincidence or illness was now understood as a coordinated wave of quiet insurrection. The psychological fallout was devastating. The illusion of loyalty, the assumption of submissiveness upon which the entire plantation system depended, had been shattered. Enslaved seamstresses, once trusted with the most intimate access to white families, were dismissed en masse. Clothing was now ordered from the North. Households instituted surveillance measures that transformed domestic life into a paranoid theater of control. The economics of slavery became entangled with fear. The system grew more expensive, less efficient, and more mentally corrosive for the white families who relied on it. Among the enslaved, the legacy of Dinah's actions was more complicated. Solomon Wright, whose testimony had revealed key details of her plan, lived until 1857. To some, he was a traitor. To others, a man trying to prevent catastrophe. His impossible choice illustrated the cruel calculus slavery imposed on its victims. On decision was without pain, no truth, without cost. The Caldwell family, once a symbol of Kentucky's plantation aristocracy, collapsed in the aftermath. Samuel Caldwell sold the estate in 1856 and vanished westward to California, leaving behind the ashes of his legacy. Margaret, permanently scarred and emotionally shattered, lingered until 1859 in a state of invalid fragility. Catherine survived, but was left physically and mentally debilitated. Constance, the family matriarch, died quietly in her sleep just weeks after Dinah's execution. Whether from age or poison, no one could say. The Caldwell line ended with her. The estate, once a monument to wealth and power, was broken into parcels and sold off. The grand house, abandoned and untended, fell into ruin. And so Dinah's campaign achieved what no uprising or escape had before: the dismantling of a slaveholding dynasty from within. She had used the tools of submission, needle, thread, trust, and turned them into weapons of resistance. Her legacy, buried and suppressed for decades, endures not just as an act of vengeance, but as a devastating indictment of a system that bred its own destruction. In the years that followed, local residents avoided the once grand Caldwell estate. No family would live in the house where so many had died under mysterious circumstances, and the property decayed into ruin, haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. Dr. Webb's scientific documentation of Dinah's toxin techniques, though initially suppressed, quietly advanced the field of toxicology by decades. His records would later be used to develop both treatments for poisoning and early forensic protocols to detect similar attacks. The coded correspondence network uncovered during the investigation was never fully mapped, but evidence suggests that Dinah's knowledge spread across state lines, influencing resistance efforts in slave communities throughout the South. For years after her execution, similar unexplained deaths were reported, never as refined or traceable, but clearly inspired by the legacy she left behind. Politically, her actions disrupted more than households. They fractured the myth of enslaved inferiority. Her intelligence and calculated defiance exposed the deep vulnerability of a system built on the false assumption of total control. Historians now recognize Dinah's campaign as one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance in the history of American slavery, a methodical dismantling of a slaveholding dynasty carried out from within. That her story remained buried for over a century speaks volumes about how uncomfortable America has been in facing the moral contradictions of its past. It wasn't until the civil rights movement that historians began to examine cases like hers, not as crimes, but as calculated resistance to inhumanity. Today, only the crumbling stone foundation and a weathered cemetery remain to mark where the Caldwell plantation once stood. Yet Dinah's legacy endures not only as a haunting mystery, but as a stark reminder that the violence inflicted by slavery always carried consequences, and that the intelligence and humanity of the enslaved could not be extinguished by law, ownership, or fear. This story reveals a chilling truth. The most dangerous form of resistance is not rebellion in the fields, but the quiet, intimate rebellion of those who understand their oppressors so completely they can turn trust itself into a weapon. What do you think was everything truly uncovered about Dinah's network, or are there still hidden truths buried beneath the surface of this dark chapter in American history? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that uncover the complex, often uncomfortable realities of our past, make sure to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves history that bites back. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.